Hey guys, it's Jasper, and this is the fourth and final part of the reading of George MacDonald's Cross Purposes. Hope you guys enjoy. It was very silent, and Alice disliked the silence more than the dimness. So much indeed that she longed to hear Richard's voice. But she had always been so cross to him when he had spoken that he thought it better to let her speak first. And she was too proud to do that. She would not even let him walk alongside of her, but always went slower when he wanted to wait for her, so that at last he strode on along, alone, and Alice followed. But by degrees the horror of silence grew upon her, and she felt at last if there was no one in the universe but herself. The hall went on widening around her. Their footsteps made no noise. The silence grew so intense that it seemed on the point of taking shape. At last she could no longer bear it. She ran after Richard, got up with him, and laid hold of his arm. He had been thinking that for some time what an obstinate, disagreeable girl Alice was, and wishing he had her safe home to be rid of. When feeling a hand and looking round, he saw that it was the disagreeable girl. She soon began to be the companionable after fashion. For she began to think, putting everything together, that Richard must have been several times in Fairyland before now. "It is very strange," she said to herself. "For he is quite a poor boy, I am sure of that. His arms stick out beyond his jacket like the ribs of his mother's umbrella. And to think of me wandering about Fairyland with him." The moment she touched his arm, they saw an arch of blackness before them. They had walked straight to a door, not a very inviting one, for it opened upon an utterly dark passage, where there was only one door. However, there was no difficulty about choosing. Richard walked straight through it, and from the greater fear of being left behind, Alice faced the lesser fear of going on. In a moment they were in total darkness. Alice clung to Richard's arm and murmured almost against her will, "Dear Richard." It was strange that fear should speak like love. But they were in Fairyland. It was strange, too, that as soon as she spoke thus, Richard should fall in love with her all at once. But what was more curious still was that at the same moment Richard saw her face. In spite of her fear, which made her pale, she looked very lovely. "Dear Alice," said Richard, "how pale you look." How can you tell that, Richard, when all is pitch black?" "I can see your face. It gives out light. Now I see your hands, and now your feet. Yes, I can see every spot where you are going to. No, don't put your foot there. There's an ugly toad just there." The fact was that the moment he began to love Alice, his eyes began to send forth light. What he thought came from Alice's face really came from his eyes. All about her and her path he could see, and every minute saw better, but to his own path he was blind. He could not see his hand when he held it straight before his face, so dark it was. But he could see Alice, and that was better than seeing the way, ever so much. At length, Alice, too, began to see a face dawning through the darkness. It was Richard's face, but it was far handsomer than when she saw it last. Her eyes had begun to give light, too, and she said to herself, "Can it be that I love the poor widow's son? I suppose it must be." She answered herself with a smile, for she was not disgusted with herself at all. Richard saw the smile and was glad. Her paleness had gone, and a sweet rosiness had taken its place, and now she saw Richard's path as he saw hers, and between the two sights they got on well. They were now walking on a path betwixt two deep waters, which never moved, shining as black as ebony where the eyelight fell. But they saw ere long that his path kept growing narrower and narrower. At last, to Alice's dismay, The black waters met in front of them. "What is to be done now, Richard?" she said. When they fixed their eyes on the water before them, they saw that it was swarming with lizards and frogs and black snakes and all kinds of strange and ugly creatures, especially some that had neither heads nor tails nor legs nor fins nor feelers, being, in fact, only living lumps. These kept jumping out and in and sprawling upon the path. Richard thought for a few moments before replying to Alice's question, as indeed well he might, but he came to the conclusion that the path could not have gone on for the sake of stopping there, and that it must be a kind of finger that pointed on, where it was not allowed to go itself. So he caught up Alice in his strong arms and jumped into the middle of the horrid swarm. And just as minnows vanish, if you throw anything amongst them, just so these wretched creatures vanished, right and left and every way. He found the water broader than he had expected, and before he got over, he found Alice heavier than he could have believed. But upon a firm, rocky bottom, Richard waded through in safety. When he reached the other side, he found that the bank was a lofty, smooth, perpendicular rock with some rough steps cut in it. By and by, the steps laid them right into the rock, and there the narrow passage once more. But this time, leading up, it wound round and round like the thread of a great screw. At last, Richard knocked his head against something and could go no further. The place was close and hot. He put up his hands and pushed what felt like a warm stone. It moved a little. "Go down, you brutes," growled a voice above, quivering with anger. "You'll upset my pot and my cat and my temper too if you push that way. Go down." Richard knocked very gently and said, "Please, let us out." "Oh, yes, I dare say, very fine and soft-spoken. Go down, you goblin brutes. I've had enough of you. I'll scald the hair off your ugly heads if you do that again. Go down, I say." Seeing fair speech was of no avail, Richard told Alice to go down a little out of the way, and setting his shoulders to one end of the stone, heaved it up, whereupon came down the other end with a pot and a fire and a cat, which had been asleep beside it. She frightened Alice dreadfully as she rushed past her, showing nothing but her green lamping eyes. Richard, peeping up, found that he had turned a heather stone upside down. On the edge of the hole stood a little crooked old man, brandishing a mop stick in a tremendous rage, and hesitating only where to strike him. But Richard put him out of his difficulty by springing up and taking the stick from him. Then, having lifted Alice out, he returned it with a bow, and heedless of the maledications of the old man, proceeded to get the stone and the pot up again, for push she got out of herself. Then the old man became a little more friendly and said, "I beg your pardon. I thought you were goblins. They never let me alone, but you must allow it was rather an unusual way of paying a morning visit." And the creature bowed concedingly. "It was indeed," answered Richard. "I wish you had turned the door to us instead of the hearthstone." For he did not trust the old man. "But," he added, "I hope you'll forgive us." "Oh, certainly, my dear young people. Use your freedom, but such young people have no business to be out alone. It is against the rules." "But what is one to do? I mean, two to do when they can't help it." Yes, of course. But now you know I must take charge of you. So you sit there, young gentleman, and you sit there, young lady." He put a chair for one on the side of the hearth and the other on the other side, then drew his chair between them. The cat got upon the hump and then sat upon her own. So here was a wall that would let through no moonshine. But although both Richard and Alice were very much amused, they did not like to be parted in this peremptory manner. Still, they thought it better not to anger the old man any more, and in his own house too. But he had been once angered, and that was too often, for he had made it a rule never to forgive without taking it out in humiliation. It was so disagreeable to him to sitting there between them. They felt as if they were far asunder. In order to get better of the fancy, they wanted to hold each other's hand behind the dwarf's back. But the moment their hands began to approach, the back of the cat began to grow long and its hump to grow high, and in a moment more Richard found himself crawling wearily upon a steep hill, whose ridge rose against the stars while a cold wind blew drearily over it. Not a habitation was in sight, and Alice had vanished from his eyes. He felt, however, she must be somewhere on the other side, and so climbed and climbed to get over the brow of the hill and down to where he thought she must be. But the longer he climbed, the farther off the top of the hill seemed, till at last he sank quite exhausted and, must I confess, very nearly began to cry. To think of being separated from Alice all at once, and in such a disagreeable way! But he fell a-thinking instead, and soon said to himself, "There must be some trick of the wretched old man. Either this mountain is a cat, or it is not. If it is mountain, this won't hurt it. If it's a cat, I hope it will." And with that, he pulled out his pocket knife and, feeling for a soft place, drove it at one blow up to the handle of the side of the mountain. A terrific shriek was the first result, and on the second, that Alice he sat, looking at each other across the old man's hump, from which the cat mountain had vanished. Their host sat staring at the blank fireplace, without ever turning round, pretending to know nothing of what had taken place. "Come along, Alice," said Richard, rising. "This won't do. We won't stop here." Alice rose at once and put her hand in his. They walked towards the door. The old man took no notice of them. The moon was shining brightly through the window, but instead of stepping out into the moonlight, when they opened the door, they stepped into a great beautiful hall, through the high Gothic windows of which the same moon was shining. Out of this hall they could find no way except by a staircase of stone which led upwards. They ascended it together. At the top, Alice let go of Richard's hand to peep into a little room which looked all colors of the rainbow, just like the inside of a diamond. Richard went a step or two along the corridor, but finding she had left him, turned and looked into the chamber. He could see her nowhere. The room was full of doors, and she must have mistaken the door. He heard her voice calling him, and hurried in the direction of the sound, but he could see nothing of her. "More tricks," he said to himself. "It is of no use to stab this one. I must wait till I can see what can be done." Still, he heard Alice calling him, and still he followed, as well as he could. At length, he came to a doorway upon to the air through which the moonlight fell. But when he reached it, he found that it was high up in the side of a tower, the wall of which went straight down from his feet, without stair or descent of any kind. Again he heard Alice call him, and lifting his eyes, saw her, across a wide castle court, standing at another door, just like the one he was at, with the moon shining full upon her. "All right, Alice?" he cried. "Can you hear me?" "Yes," she answered. "Then listen. This is all a trick. It is all a lie of that old wretch in the kitchen. Just reach out your hand, Alice dear." Alice did as Richard asked her, and although they saw each other many yards off across the court, their hands met. "There, I thought so," exclaimed Richard triumphantly. "Now, Alice, I don't believe it's more than a foot or two down to the court below, though it looks like 100 feet. Keep fast hold of my hand and jump when I count 3. But Alice drew her hand from him in sudden dismay, whereupon Richard said, "Well, I will try it first," and jumped. The same moment his cheery laugh came to Alice's ears, and she saw him standing safe on the ground far below. "Jump, dear Alice, and I will catch you," said he. "I can't. I'm afraid," she answered. "The old man is somewhere near you." "You'd better jump," said Richard. Alice jumped from the wall in terror, and only fell a foot or two into Richard's arms. The moment she touched the ground, they found themselves outside the door of a little cottage, which they knew very well, for it was only within the wood that bordered on the village. Hand in hand they ran home as fast as they could. When they reached a little gate that led into her father's grounds, Richard bade Alice goodbye. The tears came in her eyes. Richard and she seemed to have grown quite man and woman in fairyland, and they did not want to part now. But they felt they must. So Alice ran back away, reached her own room before anyone had missed her. Indeed, the last of the red had not quite faded from the west. As Richard crossed the market place on his way home, he saw an umbrella man just selling the last of his umbrellas. He thought the man gave him a queer look as he passed and felt very much inclined to punch his head. But remembering how useless it had been to punch the goblin's head, he thought it better not. In reward for their courage, the Fairy Queen sent them permission to visit Fairyland as often as they pleased, and no goblin or fairy was allowed to interfere with them. For Peas Blossom and Toadstool, they were both banished from court and compelled to live together for 7 years in an old tree that had just one green leaf upon it. Toadstool did not mind it much, but Peas Blossom did. So it's a very delightful and easy sort of fairy tale, and I think that's part of what I like about it. One of the things that stood out to me with this tale, and I recognize that, had I read this story first, of all the fairy tales of MacDonald I'd read, I think that I would have been a little bit more perturbed about the character of Alice, because Alice is a jerk. She's just, she's a jerk, and she's very timid and fearful, and she's no fun. And in a lot of ways, she's sort of the stereotypical character that's used for, women or young girls in adventure stories or stories of any kind. But, having read a lot of George MacDonald, it's very interesting because the character he writes of Alice is actually more of a standalone character. For the most part, the heroines that George MacDonald writes are, markedly different than Alice is as a sort of stereotypical female character. His girls and women are so interesting because they are so diverse. And I think what's wonderful about that is they're diverse because women and girls are diverse. And so I think that had I not read, very much of MacDonald, I would find Alice's character to just be a stereotype and not really care for it and not buy into the love story that it turns into. But because I've read quite a bit of MacDonald and, his female characters are always so strong and interesting and complex, I didn't mind Alice so much, in the way that this isn't par for the course for MacDonald. It's just, it is actually, I guess, in the way that he is just capturing different kinds and different types of people. It's not about, Alice being a woman and so she's afraid, but it's just, she's just a person and this is how she behaves. And, just because you have a story about a girl and a boy, I think, to be a good feminist, you don't necessarily always have to have the girl be the stronger one, the braver one. You have stories sometimes where they are afraid and they are, in Alice's case, she's very posh about her social standing and very concerned with Richard's. But that's part of, feminism is about, the diversity there. And so in this story you have Alice, who I think is the type of character that you usually want to try to avoid, and she, doesn't make for a good feminist heroine, but in line with George MacDonald's works as a whole, I think she does actually something very positive in the way that she is just another, kind of person. She's the sort of person who is, very afraid and, relies on the rules of society to sort of dictate what she should and shouldn't do. And Richard is somebody who lives outside of, you know, society's expectations and rules, because he's in the lower end, so what's the point of living in them? And as a result, he seems to be braver because of it. So yeah, in that way, it's sort of interesting, and it's a good story. The other thing that's really lovely about it is in the last sort of bit, how the love that develops between Richard and Alice, how it's shown, and the power that it has in fairyland. That love makes the lover's eyes lights for the other's feet. And, you know, it's not as if you love somebody and then they create light for you, but you love someone and you create love for them, which is a very self-sacrificing, you know, in service to the other person kind of love. It's a true love. It's a good love. It's not a selfish love, and that part is so very lovely. And I really, it's kind of, the story sort of reads almost like a just your typical romantic comedy, in the way that they both hate each other and they can't get on, and then, you know, in the darkness they kind of sort of stumble and learn to love each other. So it kind of reads as a romantic comedy, and that's very typical. But, you know, remembering the context of this fairy tale, and remembering, you know, its time period, it's just a very lovely kind of love story. And again, I just love George MacDonald's, you know, sense of narration, and how he pulls you through the story quite naturally. And the resolutions that they come to in the end, that the fairy queen, you know, it's almost like she feels bad for these two children having been left in fairyland by Toadstool and Peas Blossom. She's like, okay, you can come back whenever you'd like, and you sort of keys to the fairyland, which I suppose is a nice thing when you know how to come and go. But Peas Blossom and Toadstool are, you know, kind of sentenced to live together as punishment. And how very funny and fitting this is you have, you know, between the goblin and the fairy, there's a sense of class, just as there was with Alice and Richard. But whereas Alice and Richard could learn, you know, to harbor love between them, and that could change them, with Peas Blossom and Toadstool, this is not happening, except in the end of Toadstool, who, you know, the narrator says he didn't quite mind. Peas Blossom obviously did, but Toadstool was like, it's not so bad. Yeah, so it's a very fun, kind of interesting story. I enjoyed reading it to you guys. I hope that you enjoyed it. Comment down below anything that you thought was interesting or strange about the story. And as always, if there's any fairy tales you'd like me to read, comment down below. I'd love to read them. And until next time, guys, cheers.